Thank you, Miss Sally. I want to share with you a different kind of a message tonight. The message is titled 3 Goals for a New Church Year. With the new school year starting back, right on the school year's coattails, our church year will be starting back. Often church years begin in August or September, and that's certainly the case for us. And so I spent some time thinking over the last week or so of a few very simple, but what I believe are very important things that I hope in a year's time from now, we will be able to say that as a church we have achieved these 3 goals. And so I want to share those with you tonight. Number 1, retain guests. Retain guests. I'm just going to jump right into this tonight. If you were to go into my office and if you were to look in my bottom left-hand file drawer, I have about 15 or 16 files in there with all sorts of things. But one of those files is called Connect Cards. Every Sunday morning during our Sunday morning worship service, you know that I pull this little Connect card out of my Bible and I invite all of our guests to fill out this Connect card. I say the same thing every week. Some of you probably could say it verbatim back to me the way that I say it because I say it every single week. I've often wondered if our church members who are here every week, if they ever get tired of hearing me say, if you're a guest with us today, would you please do us the honor of filling out one of our Connect cards? It's a white little piece of paper. You can find it in the pew rack in front of you. You know how that spiel goes, right? Well, let me tell you why we do that. Because even though you've heard it 100 times, if a guest is here, they've never heard it. And guests, they don't want to be called out or embarrassed or be made to stand up or something like that. But they do want, at least in some anonymous as possible way, they want us to recognize that they were here. That this service was not only about us, but it was also about anybody who happened to join us that day. So that's why we do that with our Connect cards. If you were to go in that filing cabinet and look under the folder Connect cards, did you know over the last 2 years we've collected around 200 of these? And that doesn't mean we've had 200 guests in our Sunday morning worship services in the last 2 years. That means we've had 200 guests who were willing to fill out a card. We actually had much more than that. I see guests regularly, and for whatever reason, they don't want to fill it out, and that's fine. That's their prerogative, but we do everything we can to try to make it as easy as possible for them to fill that out. I share that with you about the Connect cards and the number. 200 or so. And many of those Connect cards represent not just one person, but a lot of times it represents a husband and a wife or maybe even some children. And so it wouldn't be that difficult for me to imagine we've had 300 guests in our church who have filled out a Connect card, or at least whose spouse or whose parent have filled out a Connect card in the last 2 years. That's really good, wouldn't you agree? I think that's really good, 300 guests. Here is why I say we should make it one of our goals to retain those guests. In the last 2 years, our church has not grown by 300 people. Am I right? We've had that many visitors, but it hasn't grown by that many people. And I don't say that as an indictment. I don't say it as an indictment whatsoever. I'm just pointing that out. Certainly, we could explain some of those guests were just from out of town, and they were visiting with family or friends, and they were just outgoing enough to fill out the card. Or there are occasions when we have guests who come in. For instance, we had 2 young men who played the piano for us in an offertory this morning. I don't believe they're looking for a new church home, but they were kind enough to play the piano. So there certainly is the scenario where we have a guest who's really not a candidate, to be a new member at our church because they're not looking for that. But you could imagine out of those 300 guests in the last 2 years, certainly half of them we should consider to be just prime targets, right? Well, I want us to make it a goal to retain more of those guests. And I think that's actually a very biblical goal. And I mean that in at least 2 ways. Number one, I think our witness to the community and to the lost people in our community doesn't only need to take place outside of the walls of the church, though it certainly should. It should also take place inside the walls of our church. So, for instance, if we have a lost person who just happens to find their way into church. I think the Holy Spirit does that sometimes. I think the Holy Spirit can work in a lost person's life, even though they don't have half a clue what they're doing, they manage to find their way through the doors and onto a pew in one of God's churches. I picture it like those old old-fashioned cartoons where somebody bakes a pie and they set it out on their windowsill, and you see this waft of pie smell and goodness, and it carries that cartoon character along until they come to the place of the pie, right? Well, I think the Holy Spirit does that sometimes with people who are lost, or maybe even people who maybe they have a relationship with the Lord, but they don't have a relationship with His church. And there's certainly something very important that's missing from their lives. So when they get here, when they actually make it inside the walls of our church, they're one of the most valuable people sitting in this building during one of our worship services, because they represent growth. And they're actually here, right? They're here. And so I want us to make it a goal of ours. Let's just say over the next 52 weeks, we have 60 or 75 guests who come in on a Sunday morning. And I say Sunday morning because we don't do connect cards on Sunday nights or Wednesday nights. We don't have a lot of guests typically on those times. So that number just reflects Sunday morning crowds. What if we were to make it a goal to retain just half of those? Just half of those. Our church would grow in some very significant ways. I think we would see baptism numbers go up. We would see, of course, our Sunday morning worship attendance go up. I think a lot of those folks would probably find their way into a Sunday school ministry. We'd see those numbers go up. If they had young people, we'd see our children's Sunday school or our Awana or our nursery or maybe even our student ministry numbers all go up for no other reason than that we made the effort. If there's a guest here in our church on a Sunday morning, we're going to do everything in our power to remember they are important. They are valuable. I am going to be on the lookout for them. So there's a very practical reason for us to work to retain guests, but I think there's also a very biblical reason. It's a reflection of our witness. It's also a reflection of the biblical concept of hospitality. Hospitality. Let me read to you a Bible verse from Hebrews 13. The first couple of verses there say this. It says, "Let brotherly love continue." So it's instructions that are given into the life of a congregation of Christians. It says, listen, that familial love that you have for each other, right? That sense of community, of brotherhood and sisterhood that you have. You let that continue. And then he goes on and says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. And so a command is given to us, God's people, right, in the context of a letter written to a local congregation, and says, listen, you need to be hospitable to strangers who come in amongst you. Now, who's a stranger? Well, we would say that's a guest at our church. The application would be broader than that in Hebrews 13. But for us, as we apply that to the life of our church, we would say we are hospitable, and we are obeying God's command to be hospitable when we go out of our way to be friendly toward guests. And I think there's a reason that command's given. Sure, it is a great opportunity for witness. Sure, it's good to love strangers. But another reason is this. Hospitality, I believe, is something that's easy to take for granted. It's something that's easy for us to neglect. Let me tell you, I have visited a few churches over the years, and there's one thing that I always hear at every church that I visit. We're a very friendly church. Every church believes that in good faith, right? They're not being disingenuous. Every church believes that about themselves, but I'm telling you, not every church I've visited has been the same level of friendliness. And so I think we get confused sometimes, and we confuse our friendliness with one another, and we just assume that it automatically transfers to new people who are here. But that may not be the case. It may be the case that we didn't even notice they were here. I mean, really, there are guests who slip in and slip out, and I don't even notice that they're here. And I stare at all y'all for 30 minutes. Sometimes it happens. And so God's Word tells us, well-meaning brothers and sisters, listen, be careful. Don't neglect to be hospitable. I think hospitality is like the dishes, right? They don't clean themselves. You got to get in there and go after it. It takes some effort for us to do that. We need to be proactive. We need to be careful, for it drifts toward neglect. And so let me just give you that word there. I would love for us to make it a goal of ours to really go out of our way to make guests feel good. in our service. And that takes some work. I'll give you, for instance, let's just say, you get out of your Sunday school class and it's 10:40, right? You've got 20 minutes to make it over here to our sanctuary. If you want to greet a guest before the service starts, you have to get in here before the service starts, right? And I'm not getting on anybody or picking. It's wonderful for us to have conversations out in the hall. We see our friend. Listen, I do that too. I mean, some of you, I see you on Sunday mornings, and it's great to see you. I haven't talked to you all week. I want to know how things are going. But we have to remember there may be guests already seated in a pew, and they're just sitting there awkwardly by themselves while we're all outside, catching up. And so it takes that effort. I heard recently where a pastor of a church out in California, his church runs between 200 and 300 people, so this is not a mega church at all. But I heard him testify that once a year he goes and he visits other churches. His church knows that he does this, and he does it to go out on a mission. He wants to feel, what does it feel like to be a guest in a church? Because you understand, when we're here every week, I mean, some of us have known each other for decades, and it's pretty hard for us to remember exactly what it feels like to be a guest in a church service. So this minister went and he did that, and he said that he went in the church, and the worship service was powerful, and it was inspiring. He said the people were all very friendly. He could see that they cared for one another a whole lot, and there was a great sense of community there amongst their members. He said the speaker was relevant and passionate, and he brought a good word from the Bible. And he said, but when he left that church, he said this to himself. He said, this church will never reach its community for Jesus Christ. And when he said that, I took pause and said, well, what in the world are you talking about? He talked about how great the church was. He said, because they were so friendly to themselves, just to themselves. No one was mean. Nobody stuck their nose up at him as he visited. But he said literally, he had to walk through people's relationships to get into the sanctuary, right? Friends were catching up in doorways, and they were all polite. Oh, excuse us. Yeah, go ahead. But nobody was friendly to him. And so I give that as a cautionary tale for us. When folks come into our church as a guest, I'm going to tell you, there is only one reason they're here. They are looking for something. And we want to do everything we can to remove any barriers or any obstacles from them finding that something. That something is Jesus and his church, a meaningful relationship with him and with his people. And so I want to tell you this, guest retention needs to be a greater goal for us than merely guest attraction. Guest retention is more important than guest attraction. In other words, getting someone to come to our church is not as important as getting them to come back to our church, right? Most folks will give you one shot. I mean, if you're a good friend or if you're a relative, you can get them, especially on a big campaign Sunday or a big holiday Sunday. But if when they get here, they don't have a dynamic experience, not only with God, but also with us, there's a really, really good chance that they're not going to come back. And so it's great that we've attracted 200 to 300 guests over the last 2 years. But it'd be better than attracting 300 guests? Keeping 50, right? Because at the end of 300 guests, if you're the same size church, you have to understand, keeping them is better than simply attracting them for at least one, taste of what we have to offer as a congregation. So be on the lookout for guests. And let me just challenge you with this thought. I do believe we have a friendly church. I love our congregation. I want the people in our community to know that also. And to do that, we can never assume that they just know. We can never take that for granted. We have to show them that when they're here. So number one way that you can do that, when you come to church on Sundays, look for a guest. Look for just one. They're always here. We always have a guest with us in our Sunday morning service, usually multiple guests. Look for them. And if you see one, let me give you a really radical challenge. Take a risk on that person. Take a risk. You say, well, what do you mean by risk? Go talk to them. Yeah, go talk to him. You say, well, I'm not real talkative. Well, then don't say much. But just go say, hey, my name is Deek. What's your name? So glad to have you. Hope to see you again. Take a risk on them. I've talked with folks before about treating guests well in our church, and I've heard a very honest, a very sincere reply. I want to address that real quick. I've had people say before, I've wanted to talk to a guest before, but when I saw them, I wasn't 100% sure they were a guest. I was worried maybe when I say welcome, are you new here? They're going to say, well, no, I'm not. I've been a member here for 30 years. You don't know who I am? And that's a real possibility. I mean, it really, if you sit way over here and this person sits way over here and you miss 1 to 2 Sundays a month and they do 2 and you're never here on the same one, you may not know who that person is, right? Well, I want to tell you, take the risk. Take it. Don't say, well, I'm afraid, I might offend them or hurt their feelings. They may think I'm supposed to know their name and I don't remember their name. Just go for it anyways. If we'd be willing to take a few risks on guests, I think that it would pay off some big dividends. I'll share one other thing, and then we'll move on to our second goal. But I believe this first goal is a very, very important one for us, that we not only attract, but that we retain guests. When this lesson was really brought home to me, I was sharing with someone close to me, but not a member here at our church, but a very good, a very respectful person. And I was sharing with them about hospitality. I was sharing with them about trying to help our church family together really be on the lookout for guests. And this person responded. And I think that their response was really common, perhaps to many of our response. They were like, wow, I can't believe, everybody just isn't on the lookout for guests, that just seems like the easiest thing to do. That seems like the most obvious thing to do. And so I looked at this person and I said, so were you at your church this morning? And they said, yeah. And I said, you think your church is pretty friendly, right? They said, yeah. I said, did you find a guest this morning at your church and greet them? And they said, well, and they acted a little offended. So I backed up a little bit. Sometimes you get so interested in making a point, you forget you're talking to a person, and you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. But I'm going to tell you, this was a good, godly person who believed with all of their hearts that guests should be treated awesomely at church, but who didn't do it. Right? So if we don't do it, let me tell you, it will not be done. So let's really make it a goal of ours this upcoming church year to reach out to guests when they are here. Let me share with you a second goal that I have for our church year this year, and that is to revitalize groups. Revitalize groups. Now, what do I mean by groups? What I mean almost exclusively is Sunday school. Sunday school is what church education specialists refer to as a group. You may call it a small group. You may call it a life group. You might call it a connect group. People have all sorts of names for it. A community group, a small group, whatever. A Sunday school class at our church serves in this capacity. It is a smaller group of people that you can meet together with on a regular basis, not only to study God's Word, even though I think when our minds think about Sunday school, that's probably the main thing we think about. Class members sitting there, a teacher before them, standing in front of them teaching the class. But I want to say Sunday school is that, but it should not only be that. It should also be a place where we connect with people on a meaningful, spiritual level. And we were designed for that by God. God never intended for us to be spiritual people on our own little spiritual islands who just drift into a service, who sit in a congregation and just are entertained almost. I hope the music's good. I hope the service flows. I hope the speaker's interesting, not boring, not too short, but not too long. God intended for us to do something so much more with our lives as Christians, and for that to take place, we have to have meaningful relationships with other Christians in our lives. And at our church, the number one ministry that we have to do that is Sunday school. Study after study after study of effective evangelistic churches have proven that these churches always place a strong emphasis on groups in their church. Study after study, both studies among Georgia Baptists, both study among North American evangelical churches in general. Listen to this. Let me just show you how important being a part of a small group or a Sunday school class is to the life of a church member. A very elaborate study was conducted in which the statisticians were trying to determine, all right, if a church has new persons come to their church and they join the church, right? And if one set of those persons immediately gets involved in a small group of some sort, for us that would be Sunday school. So we have a new member and we see them, we see what stage of life they're in, we learn what they're like and what sort of class they would like, and we show them the Sunday school classes that we offer, and we get them hooked up in a Sunday school class, right? You compare that new member to a new member who does not immediately get involved in the Sunday school class, and instead they just come to the large group worship gatherings. This study concluded after 5 years of following hundreds of churches with these two different types of new members, that at the end of 5 years, in the first scenario, the ones who got involved in a small group, 83% of those new members were still active in the church 5 years later. 83%. Now in the other group, only 16% were still active in the church 5 years later. Now, those numbers don't lie. We need not only a meaningful connection to Jesus, which we have, we also need a meaningful connection to what the Bible calls the body of Jesus, which is His church. And the greatest way that we do that here at Southside is through our Sunday school ministry. Now, I say revitalize groups. That's a goal that I have. I don't mean to say with that goal that our entire Sunday school ministry is dead, right? The word revitalize means bring something back to life again. That's not to say that our classes are dead. No, we have some wonderful Sunday school classes in our church that are doing some wonderful things. But I think as a whole, our Sunday school ministry, if you were to take all of our Sunday school leaders and if you were to put them in a room together and just talk about our church and our Sunday school, I think most of our Sunday school leaders would agree with me. We're really just kind of doing Sunday school. We're not doing it on purpose. We're not doing it intentionally with planning and with vision and with strategy. We're just sort of doing it because we feel like, well, that's what we do, right? We're a Baptist church, we have worship services, and we do Sunday school. Well, I want us to say, you know what? If we're going to do Sunday school, let's do it for real. If we're going to do Sunday school, let's do it on purpose. And so that's a big goal that I have for us for this next year, is that we place a greater emphasis on our Sunday school ministry. Revitalizing our Sunday school ministry, understand me, it will take time. It will not be just a quick fix. It will be something that is, though I believe, a lasting and an important fix. Our Sunday school ministry should do several things, and I think that it can do those things very well. Number one, it should help us to reach the lost. It should help us to reach the lost. There are people who are looking for friendships. They are looking for a sense of belonging and community, and we can give them that in the context of a Christian church who preaches and believes the gospel by inviting them into our Sunday school classes. Our Sunday school classes should all have the mentality that we are an open group. We want new people. It's not like our Sunday school class is a study where you can't come in on week 12. You have to wait till week 1 or something like that. No, our Sunday school ministry is very much open to new persons at all times. And that's a great way to bring them into our church. And so I'd encourage you to be thinking about friends that you have that you think would be a great fit in your Sunday school class. And I want you to be praying and planning on inviting them to be a part of our Sunday school. We are to reach the lost. We are to touch people's lives. And we are to develop leaders in our church through a ministry such as Sunday school. Our Sunday school leaders and our Sunday school teachers are wonderful, responsible, capable people in the life of our church. But they are a limited number. And we need more. And where are they going to come from? They ought to come from our Sunday school classes. I would love in every one of our adult Sunday school classes if we could raise up a person or persons that God may be calling to teach a different Sunday school class. And like cells multiply and can produce greater numbers, our classes can multiply that way. And I think Sunday school for us is the key. I'll show you how important Sunday school is. You know, on average, 70%, at least 70% of our worship attendance on Sunday morning also attends Sunday school. That's a big number. That's a big number. I wish the number were bigger, though. I wish we could say 80 or 90% of our Sunday morning crowd was also in Sunday school. I think that's a good measure of the health both of our Sunday school ministry, but also the health of our church. That's a big deal. We don't have any other single ministry in the life of our church that has that much participation from our church body. Sunday school is the biggest, most participated in ministry that we have. We do it every single week. Now the problem, though, is it becomes so regular and so routine that we forget sometimes just how important it is for us to work at it, for us to put resources into it, for us to pour ourselves into it. Here's what one person said, and I'll share this with you, and then I'll give you my final goal for this church year. He said, Sunday school, people attend because they are invited, they return because they have an enjoyable experience, and they attend regularly because they develop relationships. They are invited, they have an enjoyable experience, and they develop meaningful relationships. Those are wonderful, wonderful goals for our Sunday school. Let's invite folks. Let's make sure when they come, they have a meaningful experience. And let's make sure that they build relationships while they are here. Let me share with you a third and a final goal for our upcoming church year, and that is to renew growth. To renew growth. Certainly, we could think of many other things to add to this list that would be worthy for us to work on or to give our attention to. But I think these three things are goals that deserve our attention. None of them are all that complicated. None of these goals are original. They're just simple, but I think that they will work in helping our church to become as strong as it possibly can be. Our church, Southside Baptist Church, has known some wonderful seasons of growth in her history. And these numbers are available all on the books. And you can look back and see almost like this wonderful chart, seasons of growth where God did supernatural, powerful things in the life of our church to reach people. You can see seasons of years, especially if you go back. If you were to go back in some years in the 80s and in the early 90s, you can see that God did some amazing things, not just at this church, but in people's lives through this church. I remember not long after I got here, I found a big shoebox, and inside of that shoebox were Polaroid pictures. You know, the instant ones that you had to wait for them to dry. And as I looked through that, on every single Polaroid, there was a person, or there were persons. And there was a date, and it would say profession of faith, or it would say rededication, or it would say baptism, or something like that. And I looked through, and as I'm looking, and there were hundreds of these. And as I see these, I'm thinking every one of these represents a soul. An immortal soul, created in the image of God, who will live forever. Every one of these. And I want to say that God can do great things in our church again. He can do that. And I want to make that a goal for us for this year. I don't want growth to only be something that used to happen here. I want it to be something that still happens here. You understand, our God has a missionary heartbeat. His heart beats for people to know Him. And if we know Him, then our hearts should beat in the same way. We want our church to be a place where people can grow spiritually, but we also want our church to be a place where we can say the body of Christ is growing numerically. And I think if we can work hard to be the most loving, friendly, hospitable church to guests that we can possibly be, I think if we are willing to make some sacrifices and to commit ourselves to revitalizing our ministry of groups, our Sunday school ministry, I think if we can do those two things, we'll see this third goal transpire. We will renew growth here in our church. Now I want to talk about growth for one moment as I close, because that seems to be, what every church is chasing. We want to grow. We want to grow. We want to be exciting. We want folks to talk about what wonderful things are going on at our church. And so I want to talk about the concept of growth for just a moment. What kind of growth do we want? And how do we want to achieve that growth? I want to tell you something. I don't want to do exciting things. I just want to serve an exciting God. I don't want to make this church, just this church, to be a great place. I want the people of this church to be made great by God. That's my goal. I don't want folks to say how awesome Southside Baptist Church is. I want them to say God's doing something awesome there through those people. You understand? There's a difference. I don't want superficial excitement that may come and go as seasons ebb and flow in life cycles of the church. That's not what we want. What we want is God's people. That's us. We want to grow in this way by taking meaningful, intentional risks for Jesus one day at a time, one relationship at a time. And I think that's what will bring the kind of growth that God desires and that God honors. And I was speaking in a Sunday school class this morning, and I was talking with a brother, and we had a few moments just to be candid with one another, and we were. And it's amazing the different perspective you get when you talk to different people. I've talked to some people here in our community in my 2 years here, and some have said this to me. They've said, it's wonderful how all the different churches here in Jeff Davis County work together. I've had people tell me that, and I say it's wonderful when God's people work together. But then I've had other people, and the individual I spoke with this morning would fall in this latter camp, and he said to me, I just don't understand why churches have to be so competitive with one another. And I knew what he was saying, but I was thinking to myself, well, I understand. It's because we're all prideful, and that's where competition comes from, right? We're just sinners. But I understood exactly what this fellow was saying, and I got to thinking about it. Here's what I shared with him. I'm going to share it with you. I said, I think the reason churches can be competitive, and this isn't just here. I've been in other communities, and churches always love each other and wish the best for each other, but then secretly we wish that we were doing a little better than them. That's just the way churches do, okay? Don't pretend like you don't know that. You do know that. But I think this is the reason why. Because we're all fighting over the same people. I think that's one reason why. There's more than one reason. I don't want to oversimplify things. What I mean is this. In any community, you have a few churches, and one or two or three of those churches might be doing, okay, and then one will be doing great, and several from that church will go to this new one that's doing great, and then 10 years go by, or you see a transition change in leadership, and this one that was doing great is no longer doing great, and these other ones start hitting some new good things, and so now that people go over to this other church, and it's churches competing for the same people, right? And if we get somebody from another church on the inside, now let's just be real here, okay? I'm not saying we all give in to this, but I'm just saying this is the way the flesh works. If we reach somebody from another church, one with which we're competitive, and they come here, we think to ourselves, I knew we were better than that other church. And I'm so glad this dear brother or sister has finally seen the light. And now I just feel better about myself because they know now what I've always known. And I just feel affirmed, right? I've committed to this church for so long, and now they know how wonderful it is compared to the other churches. And I want to say, listen, there are plenty enough lost people in this community. We don't have to be fighting over each other's members. We don't, and we shouldn't be. And we all know that. We know that. But let me tell you, somebody who is better at their job than we often give them credit for, and that's the devil. And he knows the pressure points to push. And so in a community where you have a lot of good Bible-believing folks, he said, here's where I'm going to get them. I'm going to make them compete with one another. I'm going to make them watch each other and see how the other church is doing. That way they'll take their eyes off of what the mission should be. Listen, if somebody from another church wants to come and join us, great. I mean, we're happy to have you, but that is not our mission, right? That is not our mission. It's like if you could imagine a pack of dogs, 5 dogs, and there's one bowl in between all of them, and the owner comes and he dumps some dog food in there, and they all start fighting over the same food. I want to tell you, in this community, there is plenty of food for the churches to eat. Plenty. And so we have to do everything in our power to push away the flesh, which would say to us, we want other people from other churches to come here so that our numbers swell. More persons in the pew, more money in the plate. We can all go home feeling great about ourselves. Our church is awesome. That's not our mission, though. Our mission is to tell lost people about Jesus. Lost people. And if we can get that, and grab a hold of it, and don't take it for granted, but fight for it. Stand upon it. I'll tell you, we will grow. We will grow. Listen, there are much, much more people in Hazelhurst and Jeff Davis County who did not go to church today than who did. I can tell you. On my way to church, I saw somebody cutting grass. This was this morning. Cutting grass, had a little girl playing out in the yard, looked like a wonderful family. And they weren't thinking which was the greatest church in town. They weren't thinking about church at all. They don't know what we're doing, right? They don't get our bulletin. They're lost. They don't care about our programs. They need Jesus. I saw another guy, had his boat loaded up. Looked like he was headed to the river. And I was thinking, he's not wondering which church will preach the best sermon today or whose choir will sing the greatest special. He's not concerned about that because he's going to hell. He needs Jesus. And if we want our church to be the kind of place that Jesus will bless, that Jesus will honor, well, he will show up in his presence and his power in a special way, we've got to focus on what the mission really, really is. And it's not growth by membership transfer. It's getting out there one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time, taking a risk for Jesus with every person that we meet. That's what it's about, folks. Taking those risks for Jesus. So look at these 3 goals with me. We want to retain guests. That will take work. That will take work. So instead of coming in and listen, it's a wonderful feeling to belong. It's a wonderful feeling to know that you're a part of a church family, and when you come in, you're comfortable. That's a blessing. But we need to be willing, for the sake of others, to lay that aside and say, you know what? Instead of just coming in and looking only for people that I know or a nice, comfortable spot, I'm going to find at least one person who's a guest. I'm going to reach out to them this morning. I want to talk to them. I want to love on them. We'll reach people. We want those guests to come back. Remember, getting them to come is not as important as getting them to come back. And we also want to work on our groups, and we've got to do that together. Our Sunday school ministry needs to be a team who works together. If we do those things, I do believe God will bless our church with a season of growth. Don't you want that? Me too. Let me invite you to bow your heads as we go to the Lord in a word of prayer. We are going to have a time of invitation. And what I would invite you to do during this time, pray for our church. Pray that God would help us to achieve these 3 goals. Pray the Lord would challenge you tonight. Stir up something in your heart that would say, you know what?